Good evening, this is Beyond 2012. I'm Tony Kudos, your host from high up in a mountaintop. So here we are. So welcome, wherever you may be on this strange little blue and green speck in the Milky Way. And as you all know, this is our UFO and Alien Month. And tonight we are welcoming back James Horak. Those who do not know him, he is an independent researcher and discloser who is decidedly outside the streams of so-called internet whistleblower projects. He is both an insider and an outsider, and he fearlessly tells the hard truths that most do not want to hear, because it's not been sanctified by the Fed and by the appointed agents of misdirect. So that is who we have for you tonight. He's going to be covering a lot of ground on UFOs. He also has some other very interesting topics that we're going to be touching on tonight. So sit back, put your fluffy slippers on, enjoy yourselves. It's going to be another wild ride with James Horak. And it is with the greatest pleasure that we welcome James back to Beyond 2012. So welcome, James.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it.
So I know you've got a lot of things that you want to cover tonight. I'm going to let you take the mic, and maybe for those that don't know you really well, I really skimmed over your background. Maybe you'd like to share a little bit more about who you are, where you come from, and really what you're going to share with us tonight. Back to you.
I started having unusual experiences at 2. And my poor mother didn't know what to do with me, and I was playing in ditches with snakes and got tonsillitis and had to have my tonsils removed. And then I would do things like lay down in a red ant bed and enjoyed feeling the ants crawling on me, and mother would come out and have a fit. And then I ran off when I was 3 to follow a fire engine and that sort of thing. I was born in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Then when we were coming to Texas from New Mexico, there was a UFO incident. And from then on, my mother acted rather strange towards me. I had a kind of natural relationship with my mother. But we got to Texas, and then there were several odd incidents that occurred before I started school. After I started school, there was an attempt made on my life. I was hit by a car in the school zone, knocked 20 feet. I was pretty well left alone for a while. I did see a lot of UFOs, was never abducted, but there was an incident when I was in the Navy, and that incident was impacting enough to get me a medical discharge. I was sent back to the United States on a military air transport plane. Then I was routed across the country to the Philadelphia Naval Hospital. Now, I was in the Pacific, and this is unheard of to send someone across, a serviceman who is in one theater, across to the Atlantic side and put in the Philadelphia Naval Hospital and treated with a former psychiatrist of FDR's, Captain Willoughby, the only woman at the time to have been offered an admiralty. Things just got more interesting. When I was still in Japan, I was in Kuska Naval Hospital, and some interesting things happened there. I was chaperoned by a CID who was Russian-born, spoke a number of languages. It was a dead giveaway because he had a ring on his finger with a podparasha the size of a marble and always had a lot of money, and his rank was lower than mine. So just one thing after another. I got to the Philadelphia Naval Hospital. I got an inpatient job as assistant librarian and access to a floor where there were survivors of the Philadelphia experiment. And I used to read to them. So one thing after another. And then I'm sent back, given a medical discharge, come back to Texas. And had trouble finding a job because there was a code on my DD-214, which they told me no one could read. And then I discovered after many efforts to try and find a good job that they could. Then I go to the VA to complain about that, and they say, well, we need to put you under analysis. So let us send you to this place in Colorado. So they sent me to a hospital there called Fort Lyons. Fort Lyons turned out to be a government warehouse. I was given the job as assistant registrar, had access to all these records. Everybody had ever been there, which was a blast, and it found out some rather interesting things. So that's roughly my early background. But until I had gone to Utah, and I was prospecting and doing a number of other things, but until I went to Utah and went down on the Little Dolores, which is just above where it confluences with Colorado, and had an experience with an EMV operation, I really didn't know or could make sense out of all the things that happened to me. But then it was like a light turned on in my brain. I had an experience there that just opened up all the channels for me and made me aware of my connections to what was going on Earth and elsewhere.
Okay, talk about being well placed. How many people would give an arm, a leg, and their firstborn to be able to share a hospital with those survivors from the experiment? Oh my gosh. So you must have picked up some incredible information in your stay there.
Well, I did. These people were not in any condition to relate very much. They were very appreciative. I think the reason that I was sent there and put in this position was that there were people good enough that were taking care of these people to try to get someone like me exposed to them. And because not everybody in procedural authority is a monster, just most of them. When I was coming back on the military air transport plane from Akuska, from a little airfield outside of Akuska called Iwakuni. I remember because Iwakuni was on the sign when we were boarding the plane. There were 7 or 8 Marines who were all bandaged up like mummies from head to toe. I was told they were going to die pretty soon. They'd given up on them because they'd been in a stand-up bar, caught fire in Tokyo, and it caught fire, and they weren't going to live. So they were giving them morphine quite frequently, and they had me strapped into a rack that was on the bulkhead or the fuselage inside of the plane, just like them. And so finally I got tired of the morphine. I was beginning to feel like feathers were in my mouth. And so I objected and did something that the nurse couldn't open the door. And then I started feeling bad about these men because they must be in a tremendous pain. They were in delirium and they were talking about friendly fire. In other words, this was before Vietnam became anything more than a policing action, yet these men were in a situation somewhere, and I presume Vietnam, where they were hit with friendly fire, probably napalm. So this was a big secret, I guess. I started feeling a great deal of concern for these men, and suddenly the inside of that plane became foggy, like little gold bits, something that I can't account for. But all of a sudden, these men started talking, just not delirium, but they were talking like, what in the devil is this around us? Pulling these bandages off. They were fine. They got me out of the rack. They wanted some cards so we could play some cards. and then the nurse comes back in. After all this time, she's been in the cockpit, couldn't come into the fuselage of the plane. And so she comes in, she says, what is going on here? She's in shock. So we help her into a rack and strap her down. We get to Long Beach, and they put me in a co-op ward with men and women, and they're all officers. I'm not an officer. I'm enlisted. And so they're all wanting to know about me. And someone comes in, an officer, and tells them to leave me alone. Don't ask me any questions. That's when they take me to a private airport and send me across the country to Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Naval Hospital. And there we land at another private airport. A limousine comes out and picks us up and takes us to the Philadelphia Naval Hospital, which is in southern Philly.
Hang on, I got to back up here, because you kind of skimmed over something that's rather vital. So there was this mist in the aeroplane with little gold flecks in it, and all of a sudden these guys peeled off their bandages and sat down and played cards. So are you telling me that whatever happened in that aeroplane had a healing effect on all of you?
I don't even know. I don't know that. I can't say that. They could have been bandaged up to keep them quiet and kept them under morphine because of their experience in Vietnam, which they didn't want anybody to know about. I don't know. But I only know that whenever I did whatever I did to keep that nurse in the cockpit and they weren't getting that morphine, they came around, pulled all those bandages off. You know, I wasn't going to bring anything up. We had the nurse strapped in the rack, and she was near hysterical. And, you know, they didn't know what to do with her.
No, hang on a minute. It's not every day that an airplane fills up with mist with little gold flecks in it. This is not a common occurrence on any jet flight I have ever taken. So, come on, there's more to it than this.
Well, all I can say is that any time that I have an extreme emotional experience, something strange happens. I've learned to keep them at a minimum because of that, but I didn't want that nurse giving me any more morphine. And
it can get pretty heavy on little gold flecks if you keep doing that every time.
I really can't explain that. I can't tell you for sure that those men... I didn't want to discuss that with them because I was beginning to wonder whether or not I should know much more about what happened to them out of concern for them. I didn't ask them any questions. You know, they wanted to find a deck of cards. Of course, we couldn't find a deck of cards. So one of them had found something that they were occupying themselves with, something to drink. As far as I could tell, the only crew on that plane was the pilot, co-pilot, and the nurse. Pilot and co-pilot never came out until we landed.
Okay, well, that's a strange one for sure. So where would you like to take us after that? That one's got everybody intrigued, including me. I got a million questions I'd like to ask about that one.
I think they felt I could do those people on the 7th floor of the Philadelphia Naval Hospital some good. That's why they shipped me across the country, and I don't know that I did. I know that they liked my reading to them, and that while I was there as assistant librarian, I learned some Russian so that we had a library for doctors, and they were interested in advancing surgical techniques. They were getting all these Russian or Soviet periodicals because the Soviets were ahead of anybody else in surgical techniques. And so what I would do is they would come in, they would ask for a certain article. They couldn't read Russian, so I would find the article and we'd send it out for translation because I wasn't good enough to translate it.
Okay. All right. So let's get back to your UFO experiences, which I know you've got a lot more to say about those. So moving from Philadelphia Hospital, where did it take you after that?
Well, I was discharged from there, separated, and sent back and given a disability or whatever, which once that the VA got involved, this was back in 64, latter 64, that the VA sent me to Fort Lyons. I was there for about 6 months. And they decided I was 100% disabled. So I was given a disability 100% still and have it today. At one time or other, I decided that I wanted to go to medical school, couldn't go to medical school with the diagnosis they'd given me, so I challenged it and showed them that I had hypoglycemia. And when you have hypoglycemia, you simulate certain symptoms that they had put with my diagnosis. And I wanted an 8-hour glucose tolerance test and told them how to give it to me because they didn't know how. And they got a classic hypoglycemic curve, and I said, good. You can have all your benefits, just give me a clean bill of health so I can go to medical school. Then they knew I was crazy, right?
Okay.
You can't win.
No,
you cannot win.
Not with the military, you can. Come on.
Or the VA.
Right.
Well, I guess the VA is something of a paramilitary organization sometimes. I wonder about that today. You know, corporations are taking over everything. But, you know, the corporations have found a way to maintain the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, the worst of both worlds. Do you think perhaps no? Do you think they're learning from the government? I don't know.
I think the government has learned from corrupt corporations,
Yeah. Oh gosh. So let's kind of tiptoe back towards your UFO experiences, because I know that you've got some other things, and indeed, in probably the second half of the show, I know you've got some other very, very intriguing information that you want to share. We're going to keep everybody sitting on tenterhooks on that one.
Well, after I had this experience in Utah, it occurred over my coming back one night with supplies for this operation, a placer operation I had down on Little Dolores. And I had some people down there, and I'd gone into Grand Junction to get supplies because the river at night might get up and the river crossing might be too high. I would come across this national park area, which was about a 4-hour drive because it was a jeep road to get down to the river. And I was coming back, and it's about 2 o'clock in the morning. I pulled up on a ridge and was tired, and I was going to get in the back of my little station wagon. And I looked and saw this stream of lights. And they were UFOs, and they were going in a stream around a tower of rock and then coming back, going out of sight behind the cliffs of a canyon. You could see about 22 or so at one time. And I started walking down this incline to this wash. And before I got very far, I got about halfway, a number of them just got out of the formation, formed a V, and I didn't take it as threatening. When I had this problem in Sasebo Harbor that led to my medical discharge, I knew that these were threatening. These weren't threatening, but I figured, I'll go back and just hit the hay because I'm tired. So I go back and I get in my little Datsun station wagon 510 and lay down and go to sleep. And when I wake up the next morning, everything is different.
Hang on, how different? Because you tend to anticipate things.
All I had to do was think about the things that had happened to me, and everything filled in. All I had to do was think about something. It's just like when you boot up a file on a computer.
Okay, so everything that you couldn't recall from your previous experience, suddenly you could recall. Is that correct?
More than that, I guess I always had unified consciousness, but I had never really had the access to what it has. It has genetic knowledge, it has collective consciousness, and all of a sudden I had it all. And I knew what these objects were, what I thought were UFOs. I knew what they were doing. I knew about EMVs. I could feel this yearning coming from these EMVs for me to return. On and on, just everything started falling into place. And then this intuitive sense I'd always had and never trusted, suddenly I realized I could trust it. After Utah, I became more guarded in what I talked about. I was married several times and never shared anything. I think that had something to do with the problems of my marriages. And all the time, there were choices that I would make that would invariably lead to a series of consequences that would invariably lead me to choices that would always take me back into experiences where I might in some way be able to change what was going on around me. And finally, I began to realize that I was influencing things outside my immediate control. And that is when I became aware of a method of affecting time called compression of time. I quickly had to bring that under control because it cost me a lot of, well, let's say, bad results. The sad thing is there was no one to school me in what I had acquired or become aware of. I had to kind of feel my way into it. And in doing so, I made a lot of blunders. Luckily, no one but myself was damaged by them other than, I probably failed some nice women that I could have been more successful in being a good spouse or whatever. But I can't know any of that for certain. Who does? there wasn't anything that I would do that didn't bring me back to having to contend with the rottenness of authority, the rottenness of the system, the rottenness of how people were destroyed and injured by it. And so I began to study history very closely and study a number of other things. I had gone to school. I'd started in the South. My first wife had a fellowship, a teaching assistantship, rather, to Michigan State. And I went with her and finished out a degree there and started graduate school. She did very well. She was far more collected in her study habits than me. I spent too much time reading things that didn't have anything to do with my studies and auditing courses that didn't have anything to do with my major. But I was making my education pay. And so it was while I was in Ohio, after we finished at Michigan State, and she got a teaching job at a little school outside Xenia. We lived out in the country, and we lived in an area of high anomaly. And there was a UFO that over the course of a winter made a constant appearance and did the same thing all night long, all that winter. That's when I discovered how psychically blocked I suppose I could call him my fellow man was, because the people in that area wouldn't talk about this. They'd make excuses. Part of them was asleep over it. And that's the first time I communicated with a UFO. But this was really strange UFO. After that, I started opening up and asking people and questioning and conducting my own UFO investigations. And I came to the opinion that most people that call themselves ufologists were working for the wrong people.
Okay. So what kind of interactions did you have with this UFO?
This UFO, I discovered it one night. I had a neighbor that lived right across the road from me. And he and another fellow, they were from Kentucky, and they liked to go out fox hunting. The idea of their fox hunting is you turn dogs loose and listen to them run all night while you stand. This was in the winter. You stand warming your fanny next to a fire. Then when you don't hear your dogs anymore, you get up and move in the direction you last heard them. That was fox hunting. So went out one night, and so we were on top of one ridge. And a UFO comes over real low, fast, bang, from horizon to horizon. And I said, "What is that?" And they just acted like they had noticed. So we can't hear the dog, so we move. We go down this road to where these farmhouses that have been vacated because they're in the process of building a government lake, Caesar Creek project. So they'd condemned a lot of farms, and most of these houses down on that low part were abandoned. Across the way, across this field, there's another ridge. It comes out, and it's heavily forested. I'm looking over there, and I see this light going back and forth through these trees, and I think that it's a man carrying a lantern. So I'm watching it, and we're sitting in the van listening to the dogs. I see it get to the end of the ridge, and it comes out over this field, and it's throwing all kinds of colors. I would say maybe it's 30 feet in diameter at the most. And at night, it looks spheroid. But in the day, I was later to find out that it was typical saucer shape. And so I tell Lee, who is one of the men, my neighbor, say, "Hey, Lee, look at that." He said, "Oh, that's a helicopter." And I said, "No, it's not a helicopter. It's still night, snow on the ground." By that time, it had already started out towards this house, and it wasn't 200 yards from us, not a sound. I said, "No, it's not a helicopter." So it gets up to the house. Now it's not 100 yards from us, and it's maybe 150 feet up, or maybe even less than that, off the corner of that house. So I get out of the van. "Oh, no, don't get out of the van." They're having a hemorrhage in that van over getting out. And so I get out, and I walk down this edge of this ditch to cross this fence. I'm going to go up under it. About that time, a police patrol car comes around, and I turn to walk up to them and say, "Hey, what do you think of that?" And they just ignore me and keep going. They make a turn, and when they make a turn, then this UFO goes right behind them and follows right over the car back up on the ridge, on the opposite ridge. Then, after that, it starts back through the trees, does the same thing. And, of course, they're all ready to leave. They're trying to call the dogs. So I go out there the next night myself, and I watch it. And over the course of that winter, I would go over, and finally I'd go over during the day to see what was going on. But it wouldn't come out at day at first. But when I got up under it one night, after that, it'd come out during the day. And the first time I got under it, it communicated with me. And it kept saying the same thing over and over and over again. And the words I have to paraphrase because it spoke to me emotionally. And I have to paraphrase what it said. It communicated, I made the wrong choice. I made the wrong choice over and over and over again.
Oh, this was telepathically, yeah?
It spoke to me like the EMV speak to me, emotionally.
Okay.
I feel it. It's not telepathy like a mind-to-mind thing. It's emotion-to-emotion thing. The center of it's elsewhere than it would be telepathically.
I understand. So it's almost like you know it rather than a communication. So describe this UFO a little more. I mean, how close were you? You were underneath it. But just describe what you saw.
At night, it would just look like shooting colors. During the day, it resembled a brownish gray. And you didn't see doors or windows or anything on it at all. It was like two saucers on each other. It could change appearance. Over the course of that winter, I must have seen it at least 30 or 40 times. My brother came up to visit me. I tried to get him to go out there with me. He wouldn't do it. I introduced him to Lee. And while we were talking, I said, Lee, tell him about the UFO. And Lee said, well, no, I don't want to talk about it. And I said, Robert, do you come out and you get a chance to see something really unusual? And he wouldn't do it. My wife wouldn't go with me. No. I had a number of neighbors, people that lived around, and they wouldn't talk about it. There were some very strange people out there that lived in A-frames. They were young couples, and they acted very strangely, and the people around, the old-timers, didn't want to have anything to do with them, and I thought that was odd. We had gone down, there was where a public school had been, that had closed down, and the kids in the area were going into Xenia for school. The gymnasium was still there, so the young couples would meet during the winter and they would play volleyball in that gymnasium. And so my wife and I went down there one night, and we never went back because these couples were just too damn strange. They were obsessed with wife swapping, and they weren't. They were strange other than that. I had talked about the people that lived in the A-frames to some of the people there that I knew. I said, are they associated with this lake project? And they said, yes. And a very curious thing, where that deepest part of that lake was going to be, they had an exploratory well that was bigger than this derrick to this well, was bigger than anything I ever saw. And I grew up in Texas and know what a well derrick looks like. And this thing was enormous. Why would you put an exploratory well like that when you were digging a lake? Just all kinds of weird stuff like that.
So, I mean, it could take you so much further back. I mean, how many people had a direct experience of a UFO, have visited with it 30 or 40 times, have been in communication with it, and now we're dealing with a lake that has a massive hole. I'm assuming from what you're saying, the hole would have been big enough to have accommodated the UFO, possibly more.
Whatever has gone there when they were building this wasn't just a typical government project to build a lake. Whatever. And I've talked to people that are from Ohio and asked them about this, and they don't want to talk about it, or they don't know, or whatever, but they don't check it out. This is above Cincinnati. It's not far out of Xenia, Ohio. It's called Caesars Creek Reservoir. I was interested in earthworks that belonged to the mound builders, the Hopewell and the Adena, and was doing survey work documenting village sites, earth mounds, and earthworks that were going to be underwater. And I felt like since they hadn't been documented, that emergency excavation needed to be done on some of these. There was one loaf mound that was hollow. I submitted a governor's report at the governor's request. When I contacted his office about this, he said, well, if we had money, if we weren't bankrupt, do something to help this, to get this going. Of course, nothing came of it because the state was bankrupt. But in trying to excavate what I could, especially this loaf mound, I was warned by somebody representing themselves as a state employee. No, you don't want to dig into that because that would change the erosion pattern. I said, that's crock. This is going to be underwater. This is a deep part of the lake. I had become friends of a lot of the people in that area because I have a knack of finding treasure. And we're moving out, and they knew that Uncle so-and-so had hidden something. Could I help them find it? I'd found something for somebody already, and the news got around. People would ask me, would you help? Would you help? So I did, and I found a lot of stuff for these people that they would have to leave behind if they didn't find it. So I became well known, and people let me on their land. This one farmer that had quite a bit of land had kept ponies, and I kept finding these mutilations. And so I would tell him about them when I found them, and they were typical tied to alien or UFO mutilations where they were sanguinated, not a drop of blood anywhere. The cheek would be cored so the tongue could be removed through it. The genitals were removed and the rump was cored and all that. And I kept finding these, and I'd tell this farmer. I became very friendly with him. And he kept acting like, so what, you know. And finally, there was this thoroughbred. And I know the horse was worth at least several $1,000s. Found it. And I said, aren't you at all concerned about this? And he says, well, I'm not supposed to tell you, but every time that I have one of these, I call this number, and somebody from the state comes out and reimburses me, and they're quite generous. I said, oh, really? When I tried to tell Linda Moulton Howe about this, because at the time I thought she was interested in the mutilations, she was in her crop circle phase. She wasn't interested in it. But this was the only account I'd ever heard where there was any kind of official damages paid on mutilations by the state or government. So I thought that was very interesting, but she wasn't interested in that at all.
So presumably then, he was told to keep quiet about it, don't say a word about it, and you will be handsomely rewarded. Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how much they were paying him, but like I said, that thoroughbred, that horse was about 1.5 years old, beautiful. He must have been paid at least a couple of $1,000s for it, but he was very happy, so it's probably more. Over the course of the time I was there, I found 4 pony mutilations, 1 cow, and an animal that I would presume was something like a tapir. I'd never seen anything exactly like this critter. But I found a number of things on that land, a number of things. I was there trying to do this work for posterity, and I took a lot of pictures of collections that people that had found host stones and different things. The mound builders were very elegant. At the time that the Europeans are conducting agriculture with a dipple stick, they had a hoe, and the hoe stone that they used on that hoe had a curve to it in line with the curve of the swing of the hoe. Now that is technology that our European brethren did not have. So, there's more important things than iron.
Yeah. Let's just touch on the mutilation of these animals. It's my suspicion that if you wanted to start some kind of breeding program of earth animals elsewhere, animals are pretty messy, and there's a lot involved in moving them around in an alien spacecraft. But really, essentially, all that they need is the male and female genitalia, and provided that they can provide some kind of blood supply to it, and of course all the blood is removed from the animal anyway, that maybe that's how they sustain it, and that's part of the breeding program. But the thing I don't understand is, why do they remove the tongue? What would the tongue have to do with that process?
You want me to venture some information on that?
Absolutely.
These are black ops operations. They have nothing to do with ET, but they have something to do with EBs. And EBs take their nutrients through their hands, and this sort of operation is for two reasons. It's to provide the nutrients that they need, plus to keep their flesh from decaying and to make more of them.
So why do they have, forgive me for saying this, but why do they have a taste for animal genitalia?
It's part of the tissue replacement. It's an enzyme that they extract from it.
Okay, all righty. By the way, can you just explain to anyone that doesn't know what an EB is?
Extra biological entity, and the Air Force was aware, made this discernment as early as 1972. I read it in a UFO retrieval manual. It was published in 1972. Was released by accident. It's classified and released by accident in a lot of books that were discharged from the Air Force Academy.
Okay. James, everybody who listens to this show is already aware of UFOs, already acknowledges that there have been so many observations of these that there's got to be a lot to this. So take off the shackles, let's remove the control bolts, bring to the audience exactly what they want to hear. Don't hold back, deliver it just as you want it. So, I'm going to pass the microphone back over to James. He is unfettered, unrestrained. This is the real James Horak. Back to you, James.
I guess I had better talk about the UFO experience when I was 4 in Sasebo Harbor. I don't like to, but I have before, and it gives a better, clearer picture. When I was 4, my mother was moving to Texas from New Mexico, and we had my uncle, her half-brother, and her cousin. And we were just coming out of the last town in New Mexico before you hit the Texas-New Mexico state line, coming around a curve, and there's a railroad track that came along parallel to the road after you made that turn around the curve, and across was a crossing where a farm road continued across it, and there were lights at that crossing, and I'm standing in the seat. My uncle's in the back seat with me, and I'm looking out at the field to the right, and I see this flame, blue flame shooting up. And so I asked my uncle, I said, what is that light? And he thought I was talking about the crossing with the light on, because the train, I guess, was coming or had gone by. I don't remember the train. And he thought it was that. So he's telling me, oh, it was a railroad crossing. And about that time, we had made that curve. There is this white light, this pervasive white light. And the car conks out, rolls to the shoulder, the gravel shoulder. And I'm looking at my uncle trying to talk to him, and his face is froze. And all of a sudden, I see my mother just going out the window, straight as a board, floating out the window. And then this face, this ugly, nasty-looking face, pokes in the window. And something happens inside of me. And all of a sudden, this thing, it was a gray, grabs its head and runs towards this shaft of light. And so I stick my head out the window to see what's going on, and there's this UFO above this shaft of light, and I have this feeling, this urge. And all of a sudden, it starts clunking, the sparks start throwing, and it kind of waddles off. And then I see another one above it. And then I have a surge of this hate. And that thing starts doing the same thing, going off to the west. I look down. My mother's crumpled up on the ground. She's still out. My uncle and her cousin, who's sitting in the front seat, passenger side. No, he's driving the car. My mother was on the passenger side. They're still out of it. The next thing I remember, there's a nurse that's trying to coax me out of the car because I'm up over by my uncle and I don't want to leave. And she coaxes me out of the car, and I see these 4 tents that are set up in that field where I saw that blue flame. They have a big cross on them, red cross. So they take me to one of the tents. And in the tent, the people are wearing gowns. And they reassure me everything's going to be cool. And they put something in my head. And then that's all I remember. Until we get to Texas, the next thing I remember, I am playing with my great-grandfather.
That's an amazing amount of recollection, considering you were only 4. It must have made a very, very deep impression on you.
Well, I remember the rat ant bed. I remember the snakes in the irrigation ditches. I remember knocking the glasses off. I was 2 years old, and I knocked the glasses off the doctor when I came out from under the anesthesia after the tonsillectomy. My mother was always embarrassed because of what I could remember. But in Sasebo Harbor, we were on a tanker, the USS Kennebec, just before Christmas in 1962. My division had been put on restriction because the captain, who was a very volatile critter, wasn't liked very much by the crew, came down into our crew's quarters, and they didn't attention on deck. He didn't want us to attention on deck him usually. He was one of us, right? Well, we had an admiral's inspection. We hadn't done really very well. We were already in trouble because we had refueled the Kitty Hawk, and there were admirals aboard, and it was supposed to be showboating time, and they had a film crew and all that. And so we were refueling them underway. And, and they didn't put the hose connection on right, and it broke. It came loose and sprayed the crew, the band, everybody on the Kitty Hawk with oil. JP5.
And other ways to make yourself really popular are?
We did not want to be in harbor with the Kitty Hawk. Of course, we weren't, Sasebo. So the captain restricts us. We don't get our liberty. We work 18 hours without eating, rest, or anything. And so I'm not in the best of shape. All of a sudden, I guess about 2 o'clock in the morning, or maybe a little later, they call everything off. Now, I've been working for the last number of hours with my head next to an overhead where somebody was using a jackhammer on that. So I went in the best of shape, and they asked me to put all the gear back. I thought I was alone, and I go over to the rail. I'm on the well deck of this tanker, oiler. I'm on the well deck, so I go over, and all of a sudden I see lights, UFOs, coming over from the left over the mountains and out from sea over the right. And they come together and they form this V, and it's threatening. I mean, I know my steady war with EBs, so I know that I'm in trouble. I'm weakened and everything else. Well, that's when you better fear me. And I let go, and those things, I vaporized them. There wasn't even any ash to hit the water. And what I didn't know was there was crew on that ship that saw it. So the next day they take me over. I'm not in real good shape. It took a lot out of me, and whenever Reveille blew, I hit the deck and fainted. So they took me over to a hospital. And the doctors were checking me out, and they said, we're sending you a Cusca, and you're going to get a medical discharge. And I said, I don't want a medical discharge. And they said, well, we're not sending you back to the Kennebec. Too many things are going on there. And so they didn't elaborate, and I said, well, I don't want a medical discharge. So they sent me to Akuska, and while I'm there, one of the crew turns up there, and he says all hell broke loose. All kinds of CID came on the ship, and he said the captain lost his command, and now that's...
All right, I've got to backtrack you again. I'm sorry, but I've got to do it. How did you bring the UFOs down? How did you do it?
Well, you can say that I am connected with the EMVs in more than one way.
Okay. Now, come on, you're making it difficult for me. How did you do it? Was it mental? Was it... Yeah, how did you do it?
Well, the best explanation that I can give you, when I first got out of the military and started thinking about going to school and everything and getting into electronics, I had some electronics school in the Navy. I started working on a project. I can't explain how I knew the things that I knew at that time, because this is way before I had everything opened up for me with my experience in Utah. But I started working on a paper that I called the Theory of the Fusion of Metals. The end product of that would explain, oddly enough, what transpires when something like this happens. I discussed some techniques for making a metal with an internal heat coefficient of 0 that you could accomplish a great many things with. And at the time, the computers that we had couldn't exercise the controls that were necessary to alloy metal like this. But I wrote about it as a theory. And then I wanted to go further and get into what I thought was complete disregard for the physical evidence of what had gone into making up the periodic chart of the elements. Well, at the same time, I'm starting to read a number of things, alternative views of history, alternative views of science, alternative views of politics and social structure, and getting into the history of the Russian Revolution, history of the German Third Reich, and so forth. And I read a book written by one of the people that had been at Nuremberg, Francis Parker, what's his name? He wrote a book called Imperium. And I read that book, and it changed everything, my whole way of looking at everything. And I decided that what I could write about and what I could discuss, I just didn't want to hand over to a world that was insane. It would have led to being able to find a way of ionizing metal. Well, what I think I do, first of all, I can get in the computer central that these EBs depend on. An EB is nothing but chunks of meat sewn together with a computer terminal. They're not sentient, they're things. And I can get in the computer, and if you can get into somebody's computer, you can play havoc. And so what I do is I reverse the polarity of their gravity wave attenuation drive, and it vaporizes them. It's real simple when you know how to do it.
Okay, I'm going to go further back to an earlier part of the conversation when you were saying that you were visiting with this alien spacecraft 30 or 40 times, and you said you were told that you'd made a mistake, you were doing the wrong thing.
No, it wasn't me. It was whatever was inside or associated with this UFO. It was saying that it had made a wrong decision. It was opining its fate because it was in an endless cycle.
Okay, I understand. Okay. So, somewhere down the line, you have been given some unique abilities. And presumably, we are talking about two different races here. We're talking about those that are benevolent and those that are threatening. And somehow you have the ability to protect, presumably yourself, from these who are out to attack you. Have I got a grasp on that?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about two separate species here, presumably with different craft. Somehow it is essential that you protect yourself, and you have been given the means, the abilities to be able to do this. I'm surprised that with the abilities that you have, that there hasn't been someone from Black Ops or whatever eager to find out how you do it.
Oh, there has.
Okay. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, the last thing in the world they want to do is confront me, but they work in surreptitious ways. For instance, after we got to Texas, my mother, who had divorced my father, found an excellent man for a husband. My stepfather was one of the best people I've ever known. And they were situated in Dublin, Texas, and there was a little theater. And we lived in an apartment house less than a block from that theater. One night, I went down to watch Cleopatra, Cecil B. DeMille's Cleopatra. And I noticed that there was this army truck in front, parked the wrong way of the theater. I can remember it because the wheels were so high, and I kept thinking, how could I get up in that thing? Because my chin would rest on the first foot place to climb up into it. So I went into the theater, and I noticed these men in black. And there were a number of them. And they were situated on each side where the seats ended. And then they were halfway up the aisle on both sides. I didn't see one in the center, but then I saw one standing up by the ledge. There was a very narrow stage in front of the screen where two people could stand if they were real close together. And I was uneasy about it, and I sat down, and before the lights went out, I decided I was going to get out of there. I went up, and when I got to where you turned to get into the lobby, this man in black stepped towards me. So I went back to my seat. I sat down, and then Mrs. Blevins, who was the wife of the man that owned the theater, went up to the stage and stood on the stage and told everybody that we are privileged to be the subject of an experiment here to enhance your movie-going pleasure. At key scenes, they're going to release a scent or a fragrance or whatever she said that would enhance the impact, I guess, or emotions of the scene. So I really didn't like that. So she comes down off the stage, and all this time there's one of those men in black behind her. She comes down off the stage, and when she comes down off the stage, I figure, well, this is a good time for me to try to leave. So I tried to leave, and she immediately came over, and she assured me everything was okay, called me by my first name, and set me back down in my seat and said, everything's going to be fine. Just enjoy the movie and all that. So the movie starts. And I remember the scene where Cleopatra takes the asp to her bosom, and then this smell. And this smell was, I'm 6 years old, and this smell was erotic and aroused me erotically. And I really wasn't happy with that, and I got out of there. And before I did, I noticed a kid across the way who was looking at me. And later on, he happened to be a classmate with me after I started school. His name was Benny Vanderpool. So this is important later on if I continue the story that far. But years later, when I was 8 or 9, I confronted Mrs. Blevins about that. She couldn't remember any of it, but Benny Vanderpool did. She couldn't remember any of it.
So what do you think this scent was?
I think that they were trying to make me an aberrant so they could control me.
Okay.
And when that didn't work, I started school, and when I was in the first grade, I was coming home, and there was a young lady with a little girl with me who contacted me since I've been online. And right by a sign, 15-mile-an-hour school zone, I started across the little brick road, Grafton, and right in front of the Catholic church, little Catholic church. This woman came around the corner on 2 wheels, accelerated. I turned to push the girl back, and I had one foot on the curb when she hit me, and I'm looking straight in her eyes. She's looking straight in mine. It speeds up and veers to hit me. And, of course, there was a witness across the street that saw it. Now, after I'm in the hospital, broke my leg. After I'm in the hospital, she comes down there and she tells my parents she was in a hurry to get her daughter, and she just didn't know, cries and wails and all that. But it was a hit and run. And the man who owned the hardware store in town, Mr. Roden, was in his yard and saw the whole thing. Oh, there's no doubt. But I think she was, I don't think she was operating under her own steam, and I think she was trying to kill me. But I'd never had any more problems after that, other than doctors wanted to amputate my leg because there was so much bone loss. Well, my last wife was an interesting experience. She had an episode of cancer. So I hadn't been back to Utah for 10 years. And we were both working for the Postal Service at the time. So I knew that conventional treatment would not help her. So I told her we can go to Utah. So we took leave of the Postal Service and went to Utah. And while we were there, we went down on a little Dolores and lived off the land, basically. And a gentleman had leased these claims, patent claims, that I had proven out for some people that lived up on Grand Mesa, which is close to Grand Junction. So this gentleman asked me if I would help him and that he would share expenses and so forth, and I said sure. So I helped him set up his placer operation and showed him how to set up a concentrating table. He had a Steffens table, he had a Humphrey spiral, he had a trommel, and a number of other things, and so he didn't have the slightest idea how to use them. So I helped him and then did physical work to prove it out. And it was a good operation. He would have done well if he had not tried to run it too much material through the trommel at one time.
I have no idea what a trommel is. I got to be honest. Can you expand on that, please?
Well, it's a grizzly and a trommel. And what it does is it vibrates and washes rock and dirt that you put into the second stage of the operation, which is run through a Humphrey spiral, and then it comes down on your separating table. And the separating table is the final stage, and what it does is it vibrates. You have three controls. You have the angle of the incline on the table, and you have grooves that are cut into it, which are going to separate material that has a similar density. And then you have water. And you control the water, you control the angle, and you control the rate of the vibration. And you have to constantly experiment with it, level it, make sure everything is fine. And if you've got everything set right, you will start catching the fine gold. And it'll all go to one particular area of that table where the heavy iron sand, which has some platinum, it has rubies, it has different things in it that has economic value. The gold will go with it, and then you can separate the gold from that by amalgamation with mercury. So I'd set that up, and we'd start getting color. But he'd come along, he'd want to run too much. And even when we were using some detergent that would cut the density of the water so that the gold would fall out better, he'd still run too much material through there, and the oil that was in the material would mess things up, so it wouldn't catch the gold. And I'd show him, and I'd have to deal with him, and he was very difficult because his experience with mining had been exclusively with uranium mining. So he was pretty worthless as far as placer mining. He didn't have the patience. Or he could have made a pretty good living off what was right there. And it wasn't the best placer mining property I ever saw, but it was plentiful. Had a lot of material to work. You know, I kept reminding him, I said, remember that on the other side of the Colorado River, down just less than a mile, is the biggest placer mine operation in the country. So the gold's here. Anybody that tells you that it comes from the Gunnison River, which confluences with the Colorado up a little higher, they're wrong. The gold's coming from here. It's coming down from Telluride. Oh, okay. And, you know, you can't deal with people like that. Randy was a good guy, but he was Mormon. And the interesting part of the story is that this whole area was an EMV operation. And at night, if you walk up on the ridge, you can see out over this plain, alluvial, glacial cut plain. For miles, you can see these lights. And of course, the locals see them, but they're almost psychically blocked from realizing what's going on. Well, one night, one of Randy's buddies from Moab had come in, and they were kidding me about UFOs because I guess my wife had told them something about my going off at night, and she asked me what I was doing, and I told her. And so they were kidding me about it, and I had enough of it. So I said, okay, let's go. So I took them up on that ridge. It's about 11 o'clock or so, maybe a little later. Said, you see those circle of lights over there? Oh, well, that's the rest stop on the interstate. And I said, oh, no, you know the interstate's over that ridge, and you cannot see even the car lights from here, much less that rest stop. So they shut up. And I said, you see, there were orange, yellow lights and blue lights in a circle in several places. And I said, you see that first circle to the left? That third blue light from the 12 o'clock position is going to rise, come up over us, and establish itself as a sentinel right there, pointing directly to the place where it would do it. It did it. Now they're getting scared. And I said, okay, the one that's at about a 7 o'clock position is going to come towards us. It's going to stay about 6 feet off the ground, cross the river, and then come up to us. And after it crossed the river, they were on their knees crying like babies, asking me to take them off that ridge because it was in the middle of the night, dark. So I'm just laughing because I'm not through with them yet. And, of course, my wife at the time, she's on my case to take them down. So I did. Otherwise, I would have had more fun with them. So I took them back. And, of course, after that, I wasn't kidded about UFOs anymore. This is the extent. And I tried to get, when Dr. Greer got started with his exopolitics, tried to get his group in this area, because this area has been monitored by the military for a long time. They have a base, an underground base, under the La Salle Mountains, just south of this area, monitoring this. They don't know what it is. They have no concept of it, but they know not to mess with it. And
okay, I got to ask you. I'm sorry, but I got to ask you. Can you summon UFOs? Is this what we're talking about here?
Well, I don't, because I don't want to be beholden to ETs. I'm not an ET. And ETs and I have a strained relationship. They recognize what I am, and we have mutual understanding. And, they are as mystified by me as humans here are of them.
Okay. Yeah, I want you to know you're not phasing me, not even in the slightest, okay?
Well, good.
Okay, so there was this circle of UFOs of different colors, and you predicted what they were going to do. Now, was it a prediction? Or were you telling them what to do?
Are you talking about the one in Ohio?
No, I'm talking about the group that you just referred to, where you were up on the ridge with these two other guys.
Oh.
Okay. So were you predicting what they were going to do, or were you telling them what to do?
I was telling them what to do.
Okay. It begs the question, how do you have these abilities, James?
Unified consciousness.
Okay. All right. Okay. I want you to continue with this story because I know there's more to it. So you were going up on this ridge on a regular basis. So there are obviously more sightings, more interactions between you and these craft.
Well, I wasn't going there. I just went up there to make my point with them. Where I would go when I would leave at night, I was going to where I first saw the UFOs that were going along that wash and then coming around a tower rock and then going back behind, because that is an EMV operation. What they're doing is they're driving machines that are deep in the earth. That activity drives these machines, and there are EMVs that are holding your planet together because your planet's cracked. Your planet is not stable. They hold it together. And it's the only reason that they didn't succeed in a major shift movement along the New Madrid's fault zone, because they certainly tried.
Okay. So during the break, we were talking about the fact that you have an awareness, a very deep awareness of human history. And I don't know how much you'd like to expand on that.
Well, you've been through 6 extinctions, and this would be the 7th if you don't get things right this time. You allow an elite to form a caste system and establish what they call a bloodline, and then they feed you that they have rights you don't have, and they betray every form of egalitarian principle and set themselves above the law and commit the same misdeeds over and over again, and it is a pattern. And I hold it due to the split consciousness, partly also due to the fact that there is the hope that you'll survive with the split consciousness, and that the split consciousness will offer the universe something new. And that's what it's all about with the universe. The universe is trying out every variation.
Okay. So tell me something. Are you here to intercede in this in some way, to try and get us over this hurdle without blowing ourselves to bits or just plain destroying ourselves?
Well, in the last few years, I've brought ETs onto my concern for doing everything that we can to see that the people here survive. Because if worse comes to worse, this planet is going to become the star to a binary system. And I think that Arthur C. Clarke kind of insinuates that in his movie 2010, although he points to Jupiter, but Jupiter wouldn't become a star because its moons are inhabited by wonderful people, and that would harm them. But the Earth, if this is a failed experiment and earthbound humanity can't be civil, can't be civilized, then you'll destroy yourselves. In fact, it's 50-50 chance you'll survive now, I'd say, and I'm being generous. I mean, over the recent blunders in the Middle East that Israel has committed in Syria, and the fact that China and Russia have drawn a line in the sand that has been ignored, anything can happen from this point on, and nothing good will come of whatever happens abruptly.
The sadness is that there are those that believe that the extraterrestrials will come and save our sad and sorry tales, that we don't have to worry too much. But really the emphasis is on that we need to take control of this situation, and we need to save ourselves as a species, because we are being taken down a railroad track on a runaway train, and we're running out of track fast. Now, we've failed 6 times previously. This is the 7th time. And
yes.
If we don't get it right this time around, that's it. There is no other option. This is it.
Well, I think that there are a lot of distractions from that, but it's just as simple as that. The truth is always simple. The truth is compelling. You know when you have the truth. You know when you're getting reality. You know that. That's in you. But the fact is, due to mind control, due to corruption of the environment, due to all the things that go on to keep people from realizing their own best self-interest, which is always ennobling. I mean, I could give you a lesson in spiritual technology right here, and that is that it's just a simple realization of what the right thing is and proceeding from there. And anybody that I've ever known when I was growing up that didn't know what the right thing was, they might not be obedient to it. But I think that there are not that many pathological narcissists or psychos, but they're all in control. I mean, ask yourself this, and I say this over and over again. How many people that are normal, that are good-hearted, that want to do the right thing, would get into the political arena when that required them going out for months at a time, talking about how wonderful they are, just so they could keep their job? I think that that is the province. In most situations, in most circumstances, unless somebody is really trying to make the sacrifice to get there and do something good for his fellow man, and there are not many like that, that is the province of a pathological narcissist. So it's a matter that the system is rigged to put the worst element of us in power and authority over us and then keep them there. So this is a microcosm of, the evil of a queen that eats up the economy, owns all the uranium claims, fights social change, political change, like crazy.
We have a saying in our household, and I'm really referring to the fact that whatever new technology comes along, the very first question is, how can we weaponize it? And
that's right.
The saying we have in our household is, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And, when you look at nuclear weapons, yes, we can do it. Yes, we can produce them. But is it wise to do so?
An example that I'm very fond of is Robert Oppenheimer was largely responsible for the development of the atom bomb. And after the Manhattan Project had succeeded, and then it was used, and they realized that its use as a political tool was more important than a military weapon, then he resisted going further in developing the hydrogen bomb. So one of the creatures by the name of Teller took that on. But Oppenheimer said, you don't know what you're doing. You don't want to do this. And he knew something they didn't know because he was a genius. He knew that a detonation of a hydrogen bomb would change time. He knew that. And so he had multiple reasons. They were all good reasons for let's stop here. But oh no. When you have this so-called guiding light that, we've got to do it before they do, this is madness. This is insanity. And, letting the peoples on earth who think they're God's chosen and they can do no wrong have access to that kind of weaponry is the ultimate insanity, isn't it?
Absolutely. The information I know about Oppenheimer and the first hydrogen bomb is that they'd done all of their calculations, and it really came back that they didn't know whether they would be producing an explosion that could ignite the entire atmosphere. Nobody really knew where the chain reaction would stop, but they did it anyway.
Well, the chain reaction is one thing, and when we're talking about that, they have had the ultimate weapon now since, to my knowledge, since 1978, probably before. But, it hasn't been in their computers that they had it before. They have had the ultimate weapon, which they don't talk about. But the delivery of that ultimate weapon was the B-58 Hustler. It carried a pod. It didn't carry a Bombay. It carried a pod. In other words, it wasn't going to release the ultimate weapon because there'd be no point in it, because the ultimate weapon would start that chain reaction. But it wouldn't be a chain reaction like fission. It'd be a chain reaction like time. This is one of the reasons why there is a continued flap that goes on where these departure points for this ultimate weapon, these modified B-58s, are south of Fort Worth, not far from where I am right now. And there is a ongoing, you probably heard about the Dublin-Stephenville flap. Just because they don't talk about it much anymore doesn't mean it still isn't going on. Because this is the mindfulness of ET telling you, you don't want to try this. You do not want to try this.
But we will, just like we'll test out the Hadron Collider, possibly produce something that is totally outside of our control, possibly even suck ourselves all into a giant black hole, and that will be the end of it. But we'll do it anyway.
I think the best way that represents a characteristic of their arrogance is The Hadron Collider is to find the God particle. Oh, this is how the universe began. Oh, really? Really?
Yeah, what a great idea. Yeah, mess with the God particle. Let's mess with the very fundamentals of physics, life, the universe, and everything that we'll probably never know. But we'll do it anyway. What the hell?
Well, what has a psycho told themselves? The ultimate pathological narcissist. There's nothing in the universe better than me. They've killed God, right? So now they're going to be God, right?
You know, it's a crazy world we live in, and certainly it gets a little crazier every day. How can people contact you? I've got like 30 seconds, so over to you. How do they get in contact with you, James?
I'm on Facebook. You can get on our blog. A lot of people asking some great questions lately, and I've been going into pains to answer them because they are so great. But our blog, emvsinfo.blogspot.com.
James, we got to cut loose. We are running out of time. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful show. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I know everyone else has. Thank you, James.
My pleasure.